So first, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. And I can't thank CCC enough for deciding to invest in supporting this endeavor. It's been really clear to me as I've been out at various conferences, like I was just at CHI at a Privacy by Design workshop, and already all of the position papers are citing the CCC work. And so it's been really interesting to see the influence that this organization has on the community. So I want to talk a little bit about drivers. Why is this important work to do now, and why I think it was very prescient of CCC to invest in this series of workshops to help provide some input on research agendas for the community. First, as a lawyer, I can't help but mention that there are a series of legal drivers. Privacy by design has been a mantra since the mid-90s, as regulators were like, oh, we really need technology to advance privacy. But you'll see it has ramped up over the past years and gotten more specific. So the General Data Protection Regulation, which will supplant, in many ways, the kind of various forms of EU member state laws with a more consistent regulatory approach, has privacy by design as part of the regulatory text, right? It will be the law, right? People are actually going to have to be doing this. Technical drivers. So sensors collecting more information, including biosensing, big data, which is not just about collecting the information, but bringing it to bear on decisions, both the critical and the mundane. Machine learning, which is actually threatening to upend many of the ways in which regulations think about privacy, which tend to be focused on a belief, a really deeply held belief that the semantics of information are known at the beginning. We know if it's personally identifiable information, we know if it's health information, and machine learning is all about inferences and emerging information, right? Something reveals something that we didn't know beforehand. And AI, which is the use of this information, the use of information to intervene in different ways, and the fact that these interventions are going to be things that are moving about in physical spaces, many of which are quite private, and in order both to build them and to monitor and understand and refine them, we're going to be collecting information about both the environments and the individuals they interact with, right? So there's a host of technical drivers and research drivers. Finally, sociopolitical drivers. So global data flows in an environment where we don't all share the same regulatory protections, and we don't all share a similar set of beliefs and values, has put a real emphasis on our ability to at least be accountable, to show that we have rules and that we're implementing them in meaningful ways and that you can audit them and provide proof that this is what we're doing. Data for good, right? There's now an enormous drive domestically, but this is true globally, to try to bring data and computation to bear on pressing social problems. When we think about priorities and societal needs, how to improve the ways we educate people, how to be fairer in our criminal justice system, how to leverage the data we have to make better, more targeted health interventions. All of these are pressing national priorities, all of them based in research that involves computer science, and all of them raising incredibly important issues about privacy and fairness and due process and the extent to which we want to tailor and intervene in very specific ways. And finally, I'm going to talk about these both, right? Terrorism and Snowden revelations. The first wave of response to terrorism, in many ways, was about surveillance technologies, right? So the use of information technology to collect and sense increasing amounts of information. But now we see machine learning coming into use, and of course we see AI coming into use in different ways. And then the Snowden revelations, putting a broader kind of political dimension on all of the above, and a deep desire to make sure that there are checks and balances, and that technology is actually advancing a broad understanding of societal needs in a way that is accountable to democratic principles, privacy being a component of that. These are some early examples of privacy by design, right? This is not necessarily a new activity. The World Wide Web Consortium's been in this game for a long time, thinking about ways in which technology can provide hooks to support privacy. IETF, we can look at things like Tor. So there's a lot of kind of early work in this area. More recent efforts have been kind of at a grander scale, and everything from work in technical standard setting bodies to actually develop privacy reviews of technical standards, to work in the engineering community. One of the things you'll notice is that very little of this is in the quote-unquote design community, just to emphasize. So this Privacy by Design workshop series that CCC is supporting is organized by a pretty diverse group. We've had a set of 4 workshops, and you will see that this takes privacy by design at what we like to think of at a socio-technical level. So there have been some questions that I've heard just in this last session about why isn't it being adopted, or why isn't addressing the problem? Why are not all these technical things comprising security as we think about it as humans? And this project is not thinking about privacy as a property of a technical system, right? It is envisioning privacy as something that is a social concept, a politically negotiated concept, and something that's going to be comprised of different components, organizational, legal, technical, right? And you can see that the structure of this series of workshops was designed to emphasize that deeply socio-technical dimension of the problem. So the first question one has to ask is, what is this exactly, right? It's a rather unclear objective. What does it mean to design privacy? Ambiguous concept. By, through, with, what exactly does that mean? And design. Is that about software engineering? Is it about value-sensitive design? Exactly what are these people after? Right, and so, and in particular with an emphasis on this, what does it mean to design the piece? Is it about development methods? For example, Ann Kavukian, who's a regulator who's kind of championed privacy by design, so much so that she actually trademarked the little PBD. Or has tried to, I don't know, anyway. Or is it about value-centered design? Is it about the adoption of certain decisional tools, so privacy impact assessments, privacy threat modelings, right? Is it about that? Is it about the use and deployment of specific privacy protective mechanisms or privacy-enhancing technologies, right, PETs? Or is it about the achievement of specific privacy objectives, such as reduced collection of personal information, right? One could think about this activity in lots of different ways. So in wrestling with this, to give you a little preview of our conclusion, for us, the goal is to build systems that inherently protect the privacy of users. And this requires that machines, policies, and processes advance the relevant concept of privacy for the specific use case. I want to point to just a few little things in here. In the machines, policies, and processes, you should see that there's a question about how you compose out of those elements. Some work that Cynthia and I have looked at together, you can look at differential privacy as a huge step forward in thinking about the way in which we preserve privacy in large data sets. But the question of what the epsilon is really matters, and that is not clear as a technical matter, that it requires some level of experimentation, and perhaps there's an opportunity for a policy input about what good epsilons are, right? So composability. And the relevant concept of privacy, differential privacy is really great if your threat model is you want to make sure nobody knows you're in or out of the database. If what you're concerned about is interference with your decision-making, the autonomy that you believe you have, the ability for somebody to leverage large data sets and learn statistical information about people like you that it is then used to influence your decisions, differential privacy isn't really responsive, right? So there are different concepts of privacy. Here are the things that we've decided it requires. Identification processes of both privacy concepts and risks related to specific socio-technical systems. It may be that there are kind of classes of privacy concepts and classes of risks that we can associate with specific kinds of systems, but we're not there yet, right? That first we actually need to be a little bit more grounded. It requires us to design systems to respect those, right? So we need to deal with these composability issues. we have to be able to assign responsibility, and we have to be able to evaluate. So all these things matter. And finally, that somebody asked, like, where are the incentives? And at least one area where the workshops have been pretty clear is that there, just as we've found in security over the years, there's a lack of incentives, right? That security is in very many ways a public good, and some of the public good problems that arise due to that definition are present in the privacy area as well, in addition to the fact that sometimes privacy and market incentives are not all that well aligned. And finally, we have to think about not how economics, organizational arrangement, and legal issues can support and hinder its adoption, because the truth is it could do both, right? That privacy laws could drive privacy as compliance, rather than privacy as something that is viewed as part of the technical enterprise as well as the legal enterprise. And so kind of the question about regulatory choices is a really nuanced one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific workshops, but first just want to talk very, very briefly about a few of the kind of overarching disconnects that we saw. One was this issue of concepts. Privacy, very ambiguous. We need to figure out how to delineate different concepts and provide some tools that help people work with them in practice. Some definitions of privacy are more problematic than others today. Differential privacy, very formal mathematical definition. We know how to work with it. Limited access to the self, not so clear, right? Methods, a lack of them. Particularly in the design area, this was noted, but it was something that pervaded all of the workshops. Measurements, we don't know how to measure privacy. We don't know how to measure privacy risks or harms. The requirement for experts from multiple disciplines that not only have privacy training, but actually have the capacity and have tools to talk to each other. This was found to be a problem both from the practice community as well as from the research community. And finally, incentives. So the first workshop, we tried to take stock of the field, and we went in with some background knowledge. Privacy is this essentially contested concept. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Laws reflect different concepts of privacy. You can think about telemarketing laws. Those are your right to be let alone. You can think about Fair Credit Reporting Act sort of protections that give you kind of control and some due process rights that limit how other people use information about you, different conceptions. Computer science, both research and solutions. Seda Gerses, who's in the audience, has done a really nice job of documenting all the definitions of privacy that animate different strands of computer science research. Standard setting bodies are doing privacy work, and interdisciplinary work is essential. So here are some key insights. One, need for precise definitions, lots of composability challenges. Even if we have particular privacy-enhancing technologies or we have approaches, it's not really clear how to compose them and how to measure once we do. Measurement, as I mentioned, uncertainty about optimal organization arrangements. How involved should different parts of an organization be to optimally address this issue? Who do we need where, doing what sorts of work? Interdisciplinary work, languages, tools, things to aid collaboration, and incentives were often missing. Digging in a little bit, we heard from several government agencies at both the federal and state level who provided some detail about their pain points as well as their practices, and we also heard from industry. From government, here are some of the things we found. They are trying to use mathematical models to protect privacy. Several of the folks who are involved in the CCC workshops have also been working with the NSA on some privacy workshops they've been doing. Using contextual, non-legal limitations to influence design, right? That for them, design is not all about compliance with the law. There is an effort to try to be more grounded in human practice, but a real suffer from lack of methods and approaches. Looking to technical standards, lots of emphasis on internal controls, not just access controls, but other more nuanced ways to provide for accountability. Wrestling with open data and privacy commitments, right? That the Obama administration, one of the first things it did is come in with a big push for open data. There's a deep desire to leverage and benefit and advance things like education and the criminal justice system and poverty by creating access to data sets that might unleash the potential of people like you and the research community more broadly. But there are huge privacy and fairness issues embedded in that activity, and it's slowing them down. So this wrestling with potential for data for good research to go really bad, right? And we can think back to some of the efforts on the genome, right, where it was opened up and then it was like, holy crap, we better rethink our policies there. Industry, lots of emphasis on cross-functional privacy teams. So privacy within industry is no longer just something that the lawyers are left with at the end of the day, that there are program people, there are engineers, there's much more emphasis on cross-disciplinary approaches. They are trying to develop educational tools for end users. They're struggling a lot with this transparency issue. How do we deal with this? How do we make information about how we're using information or what we're collecting more visible? The agile development process is a real double-edged sword, and for privacy, it's even more so, and I think they get lots of cuts. What else? A lot of focus, again, on this accountability, right? Accountable data use. Conceptual challenges I want to harp on again because it came up both in our first workshop and our second workshop. Regulators, for them, privacy is often talked about as control or self-determination, and I know you heard from Butler this morning, which is very oriented around that. The technical community, here are some different definitions. The public, ambiguous concept, right? Privacy is thrown out because it is this essentially contested concept to protect lots of different interests against lots of different harms, right? So there's lots of disconnects. I'm going to skip over these just because I want to make sure I get to. So one question is kind of, is that the right privacy, right? And that became a really important part of our conversation. Next workshop, privacy enabling design. I think what we largely found out is today we have privacy without design, right? And that is like, where are the designers? What are they doing? Why haven't they been part of the public conversation? I've been to so many conferences and presentations and regulatory-driven thing where they're talking about privacy by design. The regulators don't even know what people mean by design, right? So what could their role be in the future? How do we make it happen? Were some really important questions. Here is some background knowledge. I'm going to get to key insights. Lack of adequate heuristics. Varies by context because it's relational, but not enough of an understanding on what comprises context. Clearly, it's not like ubiquitous computing, whatever I can sense, right? There's something more there. And it's not fully exhausted by Helen Nissenbaum's contextual integrity, attention to spheres of social life. We need some more work to tease out context in a way that's meaningful for end users. Business models sometimes conflict with users' mental models. Also true of system design, right? So it's not just a business model problem, it's actually a technical problem. Users, despite all of our best efforts, still trust themselves, and there's a huge gap in economic incentives. Some of the key research issues: mental models, tools to assist users and system designers to overcome cognitive biases and users' overconfidence, tools for communication, identification of what are the methods that are best aligned with privacy work, right? So what sorts of qualitative methods, what sorts of surveys, what sorts of work? Context, role of designers, team structure. Let's give you some sense. I want to go to some of the more like quote unquote hard engineering. Which is one of the interesting things about doing these workshops is that the designers and engineering, there was a sense that they needed to have their own workshops because one would get subsumed by the other. Notes to self. Some background knowledge: design time, distinct from security, goals, a lot of focus on transparency, empowerment, and understanding the liability of handling and collecting data. Some key insights. A lot of focus on formal specifications, some frustration that they were operating at a level of abstraction that was not useful for people in practice, and not useful for the humans that had to use them, right? That the people who were designing them understood them fully, the people using them not so much. Definitions of privacy, a real sense of kind of annoyance from the computer science and engineering community that it was not clear what the goal was, right? What is the concept? What should we be working towards? A belief that the quantification of privacy and the quantification of risk can help inform resource allocation, particularly true on the kind of engineering side. Market incentives, and then a focus on de-identification or other data protection techniques that could be tailored to the privacy risk and the legal context. One size does not fit all. Some research questions, some conceptual. We talked a little bit about this. Some on measuring and quantifying. What are the dimensions of privacy risks? How do we measure success or failure? How do we design and implement techniques for detecting and measuring flows of information and other forms of privacy loss? It was really nice to hear the presentation up here that was thinking about loss. And particularly what's revealed through inference, not just through disclosure. More complete quantitative understandings of privacy risks of aggregate data. Relationship between privacy and security. Everybody understands that you can't have privacy without security, but are there ways to leverage some of the models and the lexicons and the tools that we use? How do we need to extend them? What are their gaps and limitations? And even if we don't use the same current approaches, are there ways to learn more from the things that have worked and have not worked on the security side? Some research opportunities, tools and methods for building and verifying to different concepts of privacy. So definitions and properties, policy languages, requirements engineering, information flow analysis, composability, and accountability as kind of a big set of things. And I just want to touch really briefly on the regulation as catalyst as it relates to this. Not we need regulation for privacy, but can regulation help promote privacy by design, right? And here's some background issues and some key insights. Multiple factors confound. Regulatory choices actually do influence whether or not privacy is expressed in design or remains merely a compliance issue. A lack of information and asymmetries undermine privacy investments. And this is regulators don't understand, individuals don't understand, people who are using the systems don't understand. A deep desire to leverage what we know and have found in environmental protection, an area, again, public goods problems, differences between individual choices and the collective impact. So you can think privacy at the individual level, surveillance at the collective level, right? And a need to focus on both of those, environmental law being a good source of insight. And professionals of many kinds are playing important roles, and we need to figure out how to encourage that. So here are some questions coming out of that research as catalyst, focusing on do we need process-oriented regulatory structures or performance-oriented or risk management approaches, technology-specific, viewing technology as a potential solution space. One of the things that's been very heartening to me is many of the approaches that are being explored now in relationship to machine learning and big data are looking at how technology can be used to advance fairness, right? Rather than just being creating a new problem and leaving the regulators to deal with it. And I think dealing with it in far more sophisticated and nuanced ways, and in ways that the law is actually not going to allow us to in the current political environment. And then privacy as a societal level problem, a real need for better definitions, measurement, and protections that get to the collective value of privacy rather than just the individual preference kind of privacy. So big questions. And here are some just kind of cross-cutting, concluding thoughts on some of the complexity of privacy work. And privacy research. And with that, I will open it up to questions, although I know I'm a little over time. I did try to cook it. Or we can have lunch, because I know I'm standing between you and that.
All right. Hey, Lane Harrison, WPI. I've heard a lot of talk the past 2 days about privacy from the data side over here, lots of great work there. Privacy and what it means to the user. But the thing that sits between the data and the user is the interface.
Yeah.
What are some emerging challenges in connecting the data with users and interface in the context of privacy?
So the conceptual issues, I'll give you a really tiny example because you're inviting it. Facebook has done a lot to try to work on their interface and their presentation to users of kind of the implications of using data and how you can curate and manage it. But if you go back, if you remember the introduction of Newsfeed, remember that, right? The world used to be you set your controls, who could see it, who couldn't see it, and then they had to come and they could see it. Newsfeed pushed it to them, right? And the initial concern around that, or the initial response was like, oh, people have lost control over their information. And of course, Facebook was like, you've got to be kidding me. You said you wanted those people to have the information. That's like saying we upgraded the crypto and you're annoyed, right? You said you wanted these people to have the data, now they have it. When you actually looked at the users' privacy complaints, some of them were concerned about things like stalking, right? So it wasn't that people could access the information. It was the shift in discoverability and the timing. It was real-time access to my movements throughout the day. Different interface response, different concept of privacy. Some of them were concerned about spamming their friends. It was fine when I said everybody could come look at the fact that I ate a tuna sandwich for lunch. I actually did not mean to be blasting that out to them all the time. That makes me really uncomfortable, right? And so the concepts of privacy inform different choices about things like interface, right? What sort of controls do people want? And you see some of those sorts of changes happening at places like Facebook, but boundaries, right? Different context collapse, all of these things, there's the concepts, and then some of the issues that came out in the workshops were things about lack of heuristics, lack of understanding about how people negotiate boundaries. So I think that there's a lot more kind of ethnographic work that needs to happen, and some translation of findings into potential like patterns, right? Design patterns, heuristics, things that people might actually use in a more repeatable form to do things like design interfaces.
Thanks. I'm Kevin Sullivan from the University of Virginia. I wonder, was there much, if any, discussion about the relationship between privacy and safety, system safety? I mean, in some sense, system safety is all about avoidance of unacceptable harms, a social construct, and we understand how to build these hierarchical socio-technical systems to enforce safety properties, everything from Congress passing laws to agencies, passing rules, to manufacturers implementing processes, to operational controls, whether it's air traffic or FDA regulation of medical devices. It seems there's a really close connection between safety thinking and privacy thinking, and I was wondering to what extent that was explored.
So I'll give you kind of two answers. One is it did come up in the context of our design workshop as well as our first reports from the field, in that they're like high assurance entities tend to have lots of processes in place that can be leveraged for things like privacy, right? And so can you scaffold? Are there ways to kind of build into those existing processes? And then in the design workshop, one of the things that came out is designers, particularly those from consultancies that had had the opportunity to work with different segments of industry or different agencies, found that those with a very clear safety mandate, so for example, the automotive industry, had a far deeper desire to really kind of get it right, that they were a little bit more sensitive to failure. Now, on your analogy, I do want to push a little bit. One of the things about safety is that we actually believe we can be quite paternalistic, right? Here are the things that kill people and we want them to stop, or here are the sorts of events that we want to prevent because there's real human consequences. On the privacy side, one, we don't have the same level of conceptual agreement, right? And two, there are often mitigating factors or different degrees and different kind of contextual decisions that are being made, as well as competing priorities. And so, like in a real human rightsy kind of framework, privacy is what we call a derogable right. Protection for life, that is not derogable, right? Like that's a first order priority, and so it is often as a regulatory matter in less competition. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that there isn't a level of risk management that happens in deciding how many people are going to die due to auto safety accidents and how much we're going to tolerate that. I'm just suggesting that that level of agreement about the priority is not quite there. And so I think that may be one of the things that is would undermine the capacity to pull straight from safety. But I think it's a great question and something to explore.
Thank you.
Yeah. You mean short answer, probably.
Those of us who have worked a lot in this area understand that there are fundamental limits to what can be done in a privacy-preserving way, independent of the definition. Any reasonable definition, there will be limits. Have the workshops discussed addressing those limits and who would formulate policy and how it comes about and things like that?
Yeah. So I think, Cynthia, when you're saying limits, you mean the technology can only get us so far.
I mean, no technology can get anybody beyond a certain, yes.
Yes. And I would say one of the strengths of these workshops has been saying, yes, no technology can get us all the way, no law can get us all the way, no process is going to get us all the way. And one of the questions is, how do we compose them in a way that gets us as close as we can? I realize that might not be a satisfactory answer, but very much, right? So, you know, the comment I made about differential privacy, right? Like, you know that there's some question that needs to be answered to make this work as well as it can, right? And if we think about other approaches to de-identification, right, that have been critiqued, people have been like, they're a failure, they're a failure, they're a failure. And yes, the technical system only gets us a certain place, and then law gets layered on top of that, right? And so you can look at the HIPAA de-identification rules, and they're accompanied by prohibitions on re-identification and contractual limitations. And we can say, right, as a technical matter, you're like, that's crappy privacy protection. But people say, well, we're going to try to fit the law and the technology to get us where we want to be.
Actually, what I meant, though, was
sorry.
that even with the best possible fitting of law and technology, still, we can't have our cake and eat it too. And somewhere, somehow, decisions have to be made about what kind of utility we're going to give up on as a society, as a community. Who thinks about those things, and has that been covered in the workshops?
So I think one answer is that the hope is that the research agenda will give us tools so that we can more clearly make those choices, right? I think the question between the trade-off between privacy and utility is at a national level a political question, and no amount of research is going to solve it, right? I mean, we can certainly begin to suggest that if we reduce privacy to this level, maybe we have these sorts of outcomes. Fewer people seek health care, right, if we do it in the healthcare space. And research can help us understand what are the consequences of different political choices between privacy and utility. But I don't think that the research agenda is going to answer that question.
Thanks.
Thank you.